this, ask yourself, how are the men you know doing? And yet somehow hardly anyone ever says it out loud. In public, we pretend that men are doing too well, that they have too much power. But the actual numbers, the real data, tell a very different story. Our series, every Wednesday this month, focusing on men in America, kicks off tonight. We're going to start with a conversation with Jordan Peterson, who's been thinking a lot about how men can recover. But first, tonight, the Trump administration says California is actually part of the United States of America. It's a state. And today, to prove it, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced a DOJ lawsuit against California for undermining federal immigration law.
In recent years, the California legislature has enacted a number of laws designed to intentionally obstruct the work of our sworn immigration officers. The laws are harmful to Californians, and they're especially harmful to our law enforcement, your law enforcement. So that's why the department filed a suit against the state of California to invalidate these unjust laws and to immediately freeze their effect. Federal agents must be able to do the job that Congress directed them to do. California absolutely, it appears to me, is using every power it has, powers it doesn't have, to frustrate federal law enforcement. So you can be sure I'm going to use every power I have to stop that.
The Attorney General singled out the mayor of Oakland, California, Libby Schaaf. Schaaf is one of the politicians who publicly warned illegal immigrants in advance of a federal raid so they could evade federal agents.
Here's my message to Mayor Schaaf. How dare you? How dare you needlessly endanger the lives of our law enforcement officers to promote a radical open borders agenda?
Jerry Brown, the Democratic governor of California, responded defiantly. How dare the federal government try to enforce the laws of the United States, he said, in effect.
This is really unprecedented for the chief law enforcement of the United States to come out to California and act more like Fox News than a law enforcement officer. Now, the federal government ought to do its job and not blame California for its own inability to solve the problem. I do think this is pure red meat for the base, and I would assume, but this is pure speculation, that Jeff thinks that Donald will be happier with him, and I'm sure Donald will be tweeting his joy at this particular performance. This is basically going to war against the state of California.
Meanwhile, the mayor of Oakland responded with really the only arrow left in the progressive quiver. Of course, she called people racist, needless to say. Watch.
His comments were so consistent with this racist distraction, this fear-mongering that others, newcomers, outsiders, are making our country less safe.
Joe Aliotto-Veronese is a former member of the San Francisco Police Commission. He's a candidate for San Francisco DA, and he joins us tonight. Joe, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I think you guys are getting punked by the Attorney General. I think he's trolling you, and here's why. Listen to this. I actually looked at the suit that was filed against the state of California, and it says in part this: the federal government is the preeminent authority to regulate immigration matters. This authority derives from the Constitution and numerous acts of Congress. Then I went back 8 years and took a look at a suit that the Obama administration filed on immigration against the state of Arizona, and it begins this way. The federal government has preeminent authority to regulate immigration matters. This authority derives from the U.S. Constitution and numerous acts of Congress.
That's right.
They're making the same case in the same words. So, like, you didn't object when Obama did it, but now it's racist? How does that work?
I don't think California is saying anything different. It's not California's job to enforce broken federal immigration law. It's just not. And that's what the sanctuary city, sanctuary state laws pertain to. It's exactly that. We're not.
But it's a little different than that. I mean, you're right. You're absolutely right. No state is obligated to enforce federal law. The federal government has all kinds of enforcement agencies. But what states can't do, and this has been settled law for more than 200 years, is obstruct federal law. They can't do that. And so when the mayor of Oakland warns people who are breaking federal law so that they might evade federal law enforcement, that is obstructing federal law. Do you see the difference?
Well, I understand why Mayor Schaaf did what she did. And specifically, she didn't put out any information that would have endangered anybody. That's just, that's just playing into fear. It really, They went on with their raids. People were arrested. That happened. I think what's really happening in these communities is what we have to be concerned about, and that's that the federal government, the federal immigration law is so broken. We have people that have been here for decades that have families that are U.S. citizens that are being torn away from their homes here and sent back to countries they just
well,
don't
you disagree with the law. I mean, look, I get it. A lot of people, let me just say, a lot of people disagree with the law. And, I mean, it's almost irrelevant for us to argue whether it's a good law or not. It's a law. And so the real question is,
it's a broken law.
It may be a broken law. You don't like it. A lot of laws I don't like either. The question is, can a state decide, because we don't like a law, that we're going to obstruct the law? And that's what California is doing. It is now illegal for private citizens in California to assist federal law enforcement authorities. And so I'm wondering, as a reasonable person, can you really defend that? Would it be okay for a state to say, you know what, it's illegal to cooperate with the FBI? Would that be okay?
Well, you know, no, that wouldn't be okay. But that's not really what we're saying here. There's no specific law that says that you shall obstruct, you know, any sort of legal process. That's not happening anywhere.
It's illegal to cooperate with federal law enforcement authorities. It's illegal in the state of California, according to your Attorney General, Javier Becerra, to cooperate with federal law enforcement authorities. How is that different from what happened in the South in the 50s and 60s? I know it's not the same, but legally it's not so different, is it? And if so, how is it different?
Let's be clear. No Californian has a legal obligation to cooperate with federal law enforcement.
We both agree. I'm not saying that. I'm saying California has banned, hold on, California has made it illegal to cooperate, and here you have a sitting office holder actively undermining, obstructing federal law. You don't think that that's just as a legal matter, you don't like the law, I get it, but you don't think that that is going to precipitate a constitutional crisis? I mean, let's be real.
No, I don't. I think that there are interests at the local level that override the minutia of the differences in our argument.
The minutia. Here. So let me just ask, since you've been in California a long time, your family's been in San Francisco for over 100 years, very famous family, Alioto family, grandfather, mayor of the city. You know the city really well.
Pretty well, yes. Yeah.
It's kind of falling apart, in case you haven't noticed. We checked today the price of a U-Haul to go to San Francisco was $132 from Las Vegas. You know how much it costs to take a U-Haul from San Francisco to Vegas? $2,085, because so many people are leaving. So given the crisis in your city, why all the emphasis on people who aren't allowed to be here in the first place? Why not look after your own citizens?
We are looking after our own citizens, and people are leaving San Francisco for a variety of different reasons. There are also people coming to San Francisco. But the bottom line with this lawsuit, which is what we're talking about here, is that Jeff Sessions has to be very careful, because every good lawyer thinks twice about filing a lawsuit for this particular reason. They may get a bad result. In the Ninth Circuit, you never know what happens in the Ninth Circuit. They get a bad result.
I'm sure some federal judge in Hawaii will say Trump's not allowed to be president, but it doesn't change the underlying legal point, which I think we both agree is insane and is putting us on a course toward disunion, like California becoming its own country. Will you join us or them? Last question.
Well, come on. That's a ridiculous argument. I think the rest of the United States would be very happy to keep California's tax bases. I mean, among other reasons, you know, we are very happy to keep the defense of our state. Thank you very much. I appreciate being here.
All right, Joe, call me. Call me. There's a way out.
All right.
Congressman Todd Rokita is a Republican representing the proud state of Indiana, and he joins us tonight. Congressman, thanks for coming on.
You bet.
So am I overstating what's at stake here as a constitutional matter?
No, we're either going to be a country of laws or we're not. The fact that people broke the law to get here doesn't mean the law is broken. It means they ignored and broke the law. We have to follow the law, and what the Department of Justice did today, and what another reminder of why we were right to elect President Trump president, we saw today, California should be sued. In fact, these local and state politicians who do this, they ought to be locked up themselves. And, you know, the SLAPP Act does that, stopping lawless politicians.
So they ought to be locked up. I mean, by the way, there's precedent for this. I mean, throughout American history, we sent federal troops into Little Rock, of course, in 1957, and a bunch of other places in the South. But you think that, for example, Mayor Libby Schaaf of Oakland ought to be arrested?
I do. I have a bill to do that. It clarifies federal law to say if you're a state or local elected politician who ignores valid federal law, again, this isn't broken, this has been the law of the land for a long time, then you yourself are a felon and you ought to be thrown in jail.
So it seems a pretty clear principle. I mean, no one would question this if a state were saying, you know, by the way, we're going to ignore the IRS.
Right.
Or not enforce abortion law or gun law.
Exactly.
Right? So, but why, I don't really understand why immigration law is the one kind of law you don't have to enforce.
Because they're looking for voters.
Yeah.
The open border agenda from the left is really about importing voters because their ideas are so bad. Not only are people leaving San Francisco in droves, they're leaving the left in droves, and they need to import more voters, and that's the real problem here. Underlying all this is what it's about, and that's why these liberal left politicians, starting with California, but certainly not ending there, are in such a tizzy over this.
But I mean, don't you think at some point
Look,
Democratic voters, like the ones who were born here, African-American voters, for example, let's say in Oakland,
right.
There's a lot of poverty in Oakland. It's not only legal immigrants who are suffering. There are a lot of native-born Americans suffering in the city of Oakland. At some point, don't they say, wait a second, what about us?
What about us? And that's the whole thing. They're putting the interest of illegal immigrants over the safety and concern of their own citizenry. That's how far out of whack the left has become.
You serve in the Congress, along
Yes.
with 434 others, many Democrats. Do you ever have this conversation with Democrats on the Hill?
Oh, yeah. We do have these conversations with a few of them. There's a few that are still willing to put the rule of law above all of us.
But their party shut down the government on behalf of illegal immigrants,
Right.
not on behalf of the middle class.
Their party leadership, and increasingly a majority of the minority, is right there with California. And that's why we have to keep Trump as president for sure. We have to re-elect him. But we also, in these midterm elections, have to come out to vote to make sure that they don't get a stronghold, to make sure they don't become a majority in the House or a majority in the Senate.
Well, if Republicans could articulate as clearly what you just did, they might have a shot. I would
thank
say
you.
they seem to be afraid to. But it's nice to have you tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks. Democrats have a plan to flip Texas blue under a tide of illegal immigration. Speaking of, we'll discuss the details of it next. Texas held its primary elections last night. Believe it or not, the midterm elections are now a mere 8 months from now. Democrats are looking to make gains everywhere, and they may. But long term, the state of Texas is their top priority, and it's easy to see why. Texas is a huge state. It's the biggest state that votes Republican. If Texas goes blue, goes Democrat, it's over. Republicans cannot win a presidential election without Texas. America would then be a one-party state for a generation at least, and maybe longer, given the modern left's growing intolerance for anything that resembles public dissent. So with the stakes so high, and they are, what wouldn't Democrats do in order to win? Why wouldn't they encourage non-citizens to vote? Of course, they're already doing that explicitly in other states. In Texas, it would make all the difference. Texas has the second highest percentage of non-citizens in America after California. There are more than 3 million non-citizens in the state overall. For perspective, Hillary Clinton lost Texas by only 800,000 votes. So you do the math. The temptation is there. It's overwhelming. So what actually stops non-citizens from voting in Texas? Good question. Not much. Registration in that state is conducted on the honor system, as it is in many states, most. The only way that you are outed as a non-citizen voter in Texas is when you decide to admit that you are. Texas just assumes that all voters are telling the truth. Imagine if jewelry stores had this in policy, and they assumed that nobody would ever consider stealing a necklace. That's crazy. Well, elections are more important than necklaces, but for some reason, we don't act that way in most states. According to the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, there is already ample evidence of widespread illegal voting in Texas. The state just investigated 4 of its 254 counties and 165 unlawfully registered non-citizens who'd been removed from the voter rolls. Those non-citizens had cast more than 100 illegal votes before they were caught, which kind of makes you wonder what's happening in the state's other 250 counties. We don't know. We can guess. Because you even mentioned the possibility of illegal voting, and the left pretends, well, that's not real. It's not even possible. Of course, they know better because, again, it's happening. They're lying because voter fraud benefits them. This is what foreign interference actually looks like in an election. Democrats are openly pushing it. When they aren't making it easier for illegal immigrants to register to vote, they are fighting efforts to identify fraudulent voters. Then they're demanding outright amnesty would make the whole scheme legal if it passed. Republicans are helping them with that for some reason. A brand new electorate from a different foreign country. That's what they want. Vladimir Putin was never that ambitious, by the way. J. Christian Adams is president and general counsel of the Public Interest Legal Foundation. His organization has been trying to obtain voter roll information from 2 of the largest counties in Texas in an effort to expose illegal registrations. He joins us tonight. Christian, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Tucker.
So when you hear people say this doesn't happen, I mean, there's so many questions. We know what happens. The real question is, why aren't states, why isn't Texas specifically doing anything to prevent non-citizens from registering?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. Sometimes the left gets involved in litigation. They try to stop us from doing anything. There's a trial taking place in Kansas right now because Kansas tried to do something. And the ACLU and a whole bunch of international law firms, Deckert, big, huge law firm.
Deckert?
Deckert is
Why would Deckert, Price and Rhodes try to abet illegal voting?
Well, that's what they're doing. They are attacking the state of Kansas citizenship verification. Look, Tucker, Americans should be electing American officials, not foreigners. In Texas, we asked for the voter roll cancellations of non-citizens in Harris County, which is Houston, and Barrett County, which is San Antonio.
Right.
We have a right to that information under federal law. Those 2 counties are stonewalling us and not letting us see the data.
Where's the Attorney General of Texas in this?
The Attorney General in Texas, Ken Paxton, is doing a great job on this because, let me tell you, the problem's worse than you just introed. It's much worse than that. They're finding in Texas non-citizens on the rolls across the state, and they're doing it in a way that very few states are doing. Most states have the honor system. You check a box, you say you're a citizen, you're on the rolls, period. No further investigation.
I don't understand. We've spent the last 2 years embroiled in a scandal that has basically stopped normal work in Washington, and it surrounds the idea of foreign interference in American elections. Here you have actual documented evidence that foreign citizens are affecting election outcomes. They're voting, the most sacred thing citizens do, and the left says, yeah, we want more of that. How does that work?
Well, because they like it. That's why it works, is because they enjoy how foreigners are voting. And so they hide the ball, they lie, they don't tell the truth about the extent of the problem. They try to prevent us from figuring out how bad the problem really is. And so that's what the left...
That is so cynical. It's hard to believe. As cynical as I am, it's hard to believe that that's actually happening, but it is. But my question is, Illinois is a Democratic state. It's got a fake Republican governor, but Texas has a real Republican governor. It's overwhelmingly Republican. For now, that'll change soon if they don't get this under control. So why doesn't the legislature pass a law saying you have to show that you're a citizen before you register?
Well, they may well do that in Texas. It's called documentary proof of citizenship. That's what Kansas did. That's why Deckert is suing Kansas along with the ACLU. Anybody who tries to do something about this, whether it's my organization, we have a case in Starr County, the ACLU, where we're getting non-citizen records in this tiny little border county. Anybody who tries to do something about this is attacked by the left, by big money.
But on what ground? I mean, look, I know that the truth is they want voter fraud because it gives them power and that's all they care about. I get that. But what's the pretext? Like, what's their excuse for preventing citizenship verification?
Same one that the Oakland mayor said. It's racist. If you attempt to verify citizenship, you're discriminating against Hispanics. That's in the pleadings in the ACLU.
Really? Because guess whose vote gets diluted by this? African Americans who've been here for hundreds of years, and if anybody, they have a right to representation, and their vote is becoming irrelevant because of this. Does the Congressional Black Caucus ever speak up about this?
No, and that's what's happening in Los Angeles City Council, as a matter of fact. Because of non-citizens being counted in Los Angeles, African Americans do not have as many seats because of non-citizen Hispanics being counted in Los Angeles.
I hope someone speaks up because it needs it. Thank you. Christian, great to see you.
You too, Tucker.
Former UN Ambassador John Bolton just visited the White House. What does he believe are the greatest threats facing America? He joins us next. Ambassador John Bolton, a frequent fixture here on Fox, was at the White House yesterday for a personal meeting with the President of the United States. News reports, a lot of them suggest he could be the next national security advisor. So the following question is more relevant than ever. What does Ambassador Bolton think is the greatest threat to America today? Ambassador Bolton joins us tonight. Great to see you, Ambassador.
Glad to be here.
So it feels like we're moving kind of in slow motion toward a conflict with Iran and Russia in Syria. Do you think we are?
Well, I think that's one possibility. I think the Iranians have clearly gamed what they plan to do after the defeat of the ISIS territorial caliphate.
Yes.
I think they were thinking of it when our strategists were not thinking of it, and we're now suffering the consequences with Iran literally on Israel's border, flying drones into Israeli airspace. I don't think that's the really most dangerous aspect of the Middle East, though. I still think it's Iran's support for terrorism and its continued effort to get deliverable nuclear weapons.
Right. So obviously Iran was greatly empowered by the fall of Saddam. I think in retrospect we can concede that. There haven't been any Iran-sponsored terror attacks in this country that I'm aware of in the last 25 years. There have, of course, been many, many, many sponsored by Saudi Arabians and the Gulf states and the Sunni Arab world. So why should we see Iran as our primary threat?
Because Iran, for many decades, has been the world's central banker of international terrorism, funding Shia, Sunni terrorists on an equal opportunity basis, providing arms to them as they do to Hamas and the Gaza Strip. So it's their support for terrorism generally that should concern us, not necessarily specific attacks in the United States.
But, I mean, in order to, commit American troops and the billions it takes to prosecute any kind of conflict, wouldn't you want to go after the people who are attacking us here first?
Yeah. Well, nobody's talking about committing massive amounts of troops. What we have to worry about, I think, most importantly, is the threat of North Korea's nuclear weapons program, which is more advanced than Iran's. But it all ties together in the Middle East. You may have seen reports recently of a UN inspector's study of North Korea selling chemical weapons, precursor chemicals, and equipment to manufacture chemical weapons to Syria, likely financed by Iran. So there's a palpable threat of weapons of mass destruction, something President Trump acted against earlier in his term, that the North Koreans have brought into the Middle East with Iran's participation.
I believe that they're all bad places. Though in 2015 you wrote a piece for the New York Times saying we ought to bomb Iran in order to stop their weapons program.
That's not quite what I said. That's what the New York Times headlines said.
Right. Well, that's how I read it anyway. I mean,
and as you know, they write the headlines and the op-ed writer.
Right. But I don't think that's the only time you call for conflict, armed conflict with Iran. But if we had done that then, where do you think we'd be now?
Well, I think Israel could have done it 15 years before, and we'd be in a much better place, as Israel itself and the United States are in a better place today for Israel having bombed Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor in 1981, and for Israel having bombed the reactor that North Korea was building in Syria in September of 2007.
So you've called for regime change in Iraq, Libya, Iran, and Syria. In the first two countries, we've had regime change, and obviously it's been, I'd say, a disaster. I think we agree.
No, I don't agree with that. And let me.
You don't think it's been a disaster?
No, because to argue that, you have to argue. Let's just take Iraq to begin with. You have to argue that everything that followed from the fall of Saddam Hussein followed inevitably, solely, and unalterably from the decision to overthrow him. And that's simply not true.
I would never argue that. I'm merely arguing the macro picture, since you just said that Iran is the single greatest threat to us and to that region. I think you'll concede that Saddam was the greatest counterbalance to Iran, and they were empowered by his fall. So I think it's fair to say if you think Iran is the real threat that way, it's kind of hard to defend that decision, right?
No, because I think your analysis is simple-minded, frankly.
Okay.
The Iranian threat, which stems from the revolution of 1979, was underway quite apart from what Saddam Hussein was doing. The Iranians have been trying to get nuclear weapons for 25 years.
So you don't think Saddam made Iran stronger?
I think it made the fall of Saddam, did not make Iran stronger. What made Iran stronger ultimately was the withdrawal of American forces in 2011.
So if I'm not saying you're the only person who thinks that. You're the only person I have met who thinks that. What would you say if you could sum up the one lesson from what has happened in Iraq? What would it be?
Well, I think the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, that military action, was a resounding success. I think the mistakes that were made subsequently, setting up the Coalition Provisional Authority and others that followed from it, are lessons about what to do after a regime is overthrown. But I'd also point out, because President Bush's surge policy, when his administration ended, stability had returned to Iraq. It was not a place you'd go for vacation.
Right.
But he turned it over to Barack Obama, and it fell apart subsequently. And the point I think you need to understand is that life is complicated in the Middle East. And when you say, well, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein was a mistake, is simplistic.
I would argue that I'm the one who understands how complicated it is, but just my view.
It's your long experience in foreign policy.
Better record than yours, I would say. But thank you, Ambassador. Good to see you.
Sure.
There's new information about failures by police following the Parkland school shooting, and that's next.
The future.
There are new developments tonight in the Florida school shooting. With those, joining us now is Fox's Matt Finn. Hey, Matt.
Tucker, the Broward County Sheriff's Office posted a new fact-checker website, which it says is meant to clarify misinformation and allegations surrounding the Parkland, Florida shooting. The website says claims that some deputies were told they could not enter without a body camera is false, explaining any suggestion that Sheriff Scott Israel or any deputy from the Broward Sheriff's Office ordered body cameras to be turned on prior to entering the school is false. However, multiple law enforcement sources tell Fox News there were some deputies that could not enter the school without a body camera that day. Noteworthy that the sheriff explains no one was ordered to turn on their camera before entering. It doesn't say no one was told not to enter without a camera. The sheriff's new website also says claims that Captain Jan Jordan commanded deputies to stage or form a perimeter too soon instead of focusing on neutralizing the shooter are also false, explaining in part the shooting stopped when Jordan asked about a perimeter to protect a nearby school and that the suspect had already fled the high school. However, multiple law enforcement sources tell Fox News Jordan ordered a perimeter, did not ask for one. And the dispatch logs obtained by Fox News even appear to indicate that just 11 minutes after the shooting began, even as new calls of victims were still coming in, Jordan said over the radio, "Need a perimeter." And after the perimeter command, even an air crew said it wasn't taking off because the shooter had not yet been contained. And new tonight, the FBI admits that the staffer who took that phone call in January in which the FBI was tipped off about Nicholas Cruz failed to ask investigative follow-up questions. Tucker.
Matt Finn for us. Thanks for that, Matt. Well, something ominous is happening to American men. If you've been paying attention, you've noticed it. Jordan Peterson joins us to explain what we can do. Our series is next. Now to the first part of a series you'll see here every Wednesday in the month of March, focusing on men in America. The signs are everywhere. If you're a middle-aged man, you probably know a peer who has killed himself in recent years, at least one. If you're a parent, you may have noticed that your daughter's friends seem a little more on the ball than your son's. They get better grades, they smoke much less marijuana, they spend less time playing video games, they go to more prestigious colleges. If you're an employer, you may have noticed that your female employees show up on time. The young men often don't. And of course, if you live in this country, you've just seen a horrifying series of mass shootings, far more than we've ever had. Women didn't do that. In every case, the shooter was a man. Something ominous is happening to men in America. Everyone who pays attention knows that. What's odd is how rarely you hear it publicly acknowledged. Our leaders pledge to create more opportunities for women and girls, whom they imply are failing. Men don't need help. They're the patriarchy. They're fine, more than fine. But are they fine? Here are the numbers. Start with the most basic, life and death. The average American man will die 5 years before the average American woman. One of the reasons for this is addiction. Men are more than twice as likely as women to become alcoholics. They're also twice as likely to die of a drug OD. In New Hampshire, one of the states hardest hit by the opioid crisis, 73% of overdose deaths were men. But the saddest reason for shortened lifespans is suicide. 77% of all suicides in America are committed by men. The overall rate is increasing at a dramatic pace. Between 1997 and 2014, there was a 43% rise in suicide deaths among middle-aged American men. The rates are highest among American Indian and white men, who kill themselves at about 10 times the rate of Hispanic and black women. You often hear America's incarceration crisis. Well, that's almost exclusively a male problem, too. Over 90% of inmates are men. Now, these problems are complex, but we know that they start young. And relative to girls, boys are failing in school. More girls than boys graduate high school. Considerably more go to and graduate from college. In schools at every level, boys account for the overwhelming majority of discipline cases. One study found that fully 1 in 5 high school boys had been diagnosed with some form of hyperactivity disorder. That's compared with just 1 in 11 girls. Many of them were medicated for it. The long-term health effects of those medications, not fully understood, but they do appear to include depression in later life. Women now decisively outnumber men in graduate school. They earn the majority of doctoral degrees. They're now the majority of new enrollees in both law and medical schools. For men, the consequences of failing in school are long-term and profound. Between 1979 and 2010, working-age men with only high school degrees saw their real hourly wages drop about 20%. Over the same period, high school-educated women saw their wages rise. The decline of the industrial economy disproportionately hurt men. There are now 7 million working-age men in America who don't work. They've dropped out of the labor force. Nearly half of them take pain medication on any given day. That is the highest rate in the world by far. Far fewer young men get married than did just a few decades ago, and fewer stay married. About 1 in 5 American children live now only with their mothers. That's double the rate of 1970. Millions more boys growing up without fathers. Young adult men are now more likely to live with a parent than they are to live with a spouse or a partner. That is not the case for young women. Single women buy their own homes at more than twice the rate of single men. More women than men now have driver's licenses. Whenever gender differences come up in public debate, the so-called wage gap seems to dominate the conversation. You've heard it. A woman makes 77 cents for every dollar a man earns. That's a statistic that you'll hear a lot. Presidents have repeated it, many candidates. It's everywhere. And yet that number compares all American men to all American women across all professions. No legitimate social scientist would consider that a valid or meaningful measure. The number doesn't mean anything. It's intentionally misleading. It's a talking point. Once you compare men and women with similar experience, working the same hours and similar jobs for the same period of time, that's the only way you can measure it, the gap all but disappears. In fact, it may invert. One study using census data found that single women in their 20s living in metropolitan areas now earn 8% more on average than their male counterparts. By the way, the majority of managers in the workplace are now women. Women on average are scoring higher on IQ tests than men are. Even physically, men are falling behind. A recent study found that almost half of young men failed the Army's entry-level physical fitness exam during basic training. Fully 70% of American men are now overweight or obese. That's compared to 59% of American women. Perhaps most bafflingly and terrifyingly, men seem to be becoming less male fundamentally. Measurably. Sperm counts, for example, across the West have plummeted. They're down almost 60% since the early 1970s. Scientists don't know why this is. Testosterone levels in men have also fallen precipitously. One study found that average levels of male testosterone dropped by 1% every year after 1987, and it's not related to age. In other words, the average 40-year-old man in 2017 would have testosterone levels 30% lower than the average 40-year-old man in 1987. There is no upside to this trend. Lower testosterone levels in men are associated with depression, lethargy, weight gain, decreased cognitive ability. Nothing like this has ever happened to a population this big. So you'd think we'd want to know exactly why. What's going on? How do we fix it? And yet the media ignore that story. It's considered a fringe topic somehow. Nor is it, believe it or not, a priority in the scientific research establishment. We checked, and we couldn't find a single NIH-funded study on why testosterone levels are falling. We did find a study on, quote, pubic hair grooming prevalence and motivation among women in the U.S., So those are the numbers, and they paint a very clear picture. American men are failing in body, in mind, and in spirit. This is a crisis. Yet our leaders pretend it's not happening, and in fact they tell us the opposite is true. Women are victims, men are oppressors. To question that assumption is to risk punishment. Even as women far outpace men in higher education, for example, virtually every college campus supports a women's studies department whose core goal is to attack male power. Our politicians and business leaders internalize and amplify that message. Men are privileged, women are oppressed. Hire and promote and reward accordingly. Now, that would be fine if it were true, but it's not true. At best, it's an outdated view of an America that no longer exists. At worst, it's a pernicious lie. Either way, ignoring the decline of men does not help anyone. Men and women need each other. One cannot exist without the other. That is elemental biology. It's also the reality that each one of us has lived with our parents and siblings and friends. When men fail, all of us suffer. How did this happen? How can we fix it? We hope that this series, each Wednesday this month, answers those questions. Jordan Peterson is a professor at the University of Toronto. He's written a lot about the decline of modern men. We spoke to him recently. Jordan Peterson, thanks for joining us. We've got a long list of statistics that paint a pretty clear picture that boys seem to be falling behind relative to girls in the United States. Why do you think that is?
I think that that's partly a consequence of directed policy. So it's linked to the idea that there's something wrong with masculinity, and so that the expression of masculinity should be limited in all sorts of arbitrary ways. The fact that kids can't really play at schools anymore is a manifestation of that. The fact that male behavior is often diagnosed as attention deficit disordered, for example, is a manifestation of that. The elimination of competition as a valid form of human interaction, and the failure to recognize that competitive sports, for example, are deeply cooperative in their fundamental nature, as long as everyone is playing by the rules, obviously. So there's that. That's a large part of it.
So you're saying that there is an organized, not always explicit, but still organized attempt to de-emphasize masculinity or to punish masculinity. Why?
Because it's easy to mistake masculine competence for the tyranny that hypothetically drives the patriarchy. It's part of a ideological worldview that sees the entire history of mankind as the oppression of women by men, which is a dreadful way of looking at the world, a very pathological way of looking at the world. It's not like men and women always get along any more than men and men get along, or women and women for that matter. But fundamentally, human history is a cooperative enterprise, and men and women have lifted themselves out of the mire over millennia in their cooperative endeavor. And to describe that as centuries of the oppression of women by men is an absolutely reprehensible ideological rewrite of history. And it's what's taught in the humanities and in much of the social sciences at universities, and increasingly in the public education system. It's taken as an unassailable fact.
And you're saying that this has bad consequences for the development of boys?
Well, how could you feel good about that? I mean, if you're made out to be a potential manifestation of rape culture, if you're part of toxic masculinity, if your competitive drive is regarded as part of a tyrannical impulse, if the heritage to which you belong is regarded as an oppressive patriarchy, then how in the world are you going to step forward with confidence and shoulder that what would you call it, that burden? Why would you? Why wouldn't you just step aside and retreat, which is exactly what's happening?
But if men are so aggressive and bent on domination, on establishing a patriarchy, why have they stepped back and allowed this to happen?
Yeah, well, I guess that's a good question, isn't it? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if they are precisely allowing it to happen. It's very insidious, the ideological movement that's driving this, part of the radical left. Part of the radical left, I would say, is it's a very insidious movement. It's not an easy thing to resist, and a lot of it occurs, well, for example, it occurs in the school system increasingly. And it isn't clear they're not men that are reacting to that, that's boys. It's not clear what they're supposed to do about it. So
if you were to
fight an ideological battle.
It is hard. And finally, if you were to give parents of boys one piece of advice for how, in their small way, they can fight against this trend for the sake of their own boys, what would it be?
Well, I would say, first of all, encourage them. And I mean that most deeply, is that to encourage someone is to instill courage in them, to support their courage. And that doesn't mean protect them from what's dangerous. It means teach them how to be competent and teach them that they can rely on themselves to prevail, even in the darkest of circumstances. That's part of it. Yes. I would say as well, more specifically, and this is specific advice for parents, if you have your children in a school and they talk about equity, and there's class, and they talk about equity, diversity, inclusivity, white privilege, systemic racism, any of that, you take your children out of the class.